Hey folks, I'm Mark Ryan. This is Super Review, and this is the new HEDD Audio HEDDphone 2 GT, which is a bit of a mouthful, and you might also be thinking, didn't you just review this headphone a couple of months ago? And the answer is kind of yes, but no, not really, because when I reviewed the HEDDphone 2 a couple of months ago, that was the original version that came out about a year ago. This is the new for 2024 GT model, which has a handful of modifications to it that are specifically targeted at audiophiles. Like that's me and probably frankly you, which okay, maybe begs the question, like if this one's targeted at audiophiles, what was the original HEDDphone 2 targeted at? And that kind of just brings up HEDD Audio's background. All right, so they have been for years making actually studio speakers. It was targeted at studio use cases using their unique air motion transformer driver technology. And the HEDDphone 2 is, I guess, then tuned for studios. I don't know. If you go back to watch my review, I thought that the tuning of it was pretty midsy, but frankly, that headphone I needed to use EQ with. And this version, well, they've kind of tuned it specifically for audiophiles in some ways, and we'll talk about exactly how, but I will just say up front, I feel like this headphone in every way, except for maybe one, we'll get to that, but pretty much every way, this headphone is better than the original HEDDphone 2. And I guess I'm an audiophile, so maybe mission accomplished, but we will dive into the details of exactly that. Now, what else to talk about in terms of price? So the original HEDDphone 2, price on that is $2,000. Here with the GT model, it's up by $200. So this is now a $2,200 headphone. Is it worth it? Well, let's talk about it. So for the past, I don't know, few weeks, I've been listening to the HEDD Audio HEDDphone 2 GT, and comparing it with some other headphones in its price range, including its predecessor. And I'm ready to let you know what I think. So that's what we're here for. Before we get into that though, a quick shout out to HEDD Audio for sending this headphone in for review. If you want to check out the GT or anything else they've got, they've only got two other headphones, but if you want to check out what they've got, I've got them linked in the description down below. But with that out of the way, let's dive to the table and let's start with the physical stuff. We're going to talk about what you get inside the packaging of the HEDD Audio HEDDphone 2 GT. Let's just call it the GT. I'm going to stop doing that. We'll talk about what you get in the box of the GT. We'll talk about changes to the physical form factor. We'll talk about build quality, comfort, all that stuff. Then we'll get into talking about the sound. We'll talk about the sound signature, including the frequency response graph. We will then get into some comparisons with some other headphones in its price range, and I will eventually wrap this review up with a score. So let's start with the physical stuff. Here's what you get. First of all, you get a nice hefty carry case. It's got semi-hard shell, but you can see it's got a nice little fabric covering. Zippers all the way around, and I guess I can unzip it and show you, although I'll warn you, there's some paperwork inside. So, all right, try to ignore the paperwork. But yeah, this is a nice little case. It's fitted for the headphone. Has a little magnetic tray here for storing the cables and stuff. Although I guess on that note, like most headphone cases, you can't store these with the cables attached. You have to remove the cable and put it back on every time. And I guess on a quick note, in case you weren't clear, this is a cabled headphone. It's not a Bluetooth headphone, even though there's no cable on it at this moment. Okay, but you knew that. All right, apart from that, you get, of course, the headphones, but we're gonna dive into detail on those in a little bit. So I'll put those to the side as much as I can. And let's start by talking about the cable situation that you get here with the GT, because this is actually one of the first upgrades with this model versus the original. With the original HEDDphone 2, I actually didn't really like the cables that it came with that much. Now it uses like your standard, I'll punch in on this so you can take a look, standard 3.5 mil termination. So this goes into the bottom of the headphone cups like so. And this is a very standard cable, so it's very easy to find alternatives if you want to swap out the cable. And I found with the original HEDDphone 2, I preferred to swap out the cable just because the stock cable is a little rubbery and a little bit stiff. Whereas this one, they've gone with a much softer cloth, like kind of nylon covered cable. And frankly, it is just a beautiful cable. It's got a really nice weight to it, partly because the little termination down here is quite weighty, but yeah, it's just got a very nice drape to it. Kind of perfect in every way, except for maybe two ways. I'm gonna say just one way. The length on it is actually quite good. It's probably about a 5-foot long cable, so a little bit longer than your average IM portable cable, not quite like a 6-foot or an 8-foot desktop cable, kind of like a nice in-between. Depending on your situation, you might prefer that it be longer, but I personally, as someone who listens to these things on portable devices, I like this cable. The one complaint that I will give it is that there is no standard just like 3.5 mil connection, and that's just because I'm a basic 3.5 mil boy. So as you can see, there's actually two cables here. This one terminates in 6.3 mil. That's right. And then this one over here actually terminates in 4.4 millimeter balance connection. So you have a balance cable, you have a single-ended cable, and then they come with these adapters so that you can adapt them to different terminations, right? So you can take this balance connector, plug it into this, and then now you've got an XLR balance connector. And then same with this, you can take the single-ended 6.3, connect it to this chonky pigtail, and then have a standard 3.5 mil connector. Here's what I'll say on this. I wish this cable was the other way around. I wish that it was 3.5 on the built-in end, and then there was an adapter to adapt up to 6.3 mil. Because this way, I think actually makes sense, right? Where you go from the smaller connector to the larger one. Because if you're using this on like a desktop setup, which is probably what you're using if you're using an XLR, having this little extra pigtail doesn't really make a difference, right? But if you're using a portable scenario, this is kind of a little bit clunky. So I do wish that it went the other way around, but I don't know. That frankly, that's picking nits. For the most part, I actually just use the 4.4 mil cable because, well, I've got portable sources with 4.4 mil. I don't need to use a little pigtail dongle, so it's not super clunky. And actually, as it turns out, this headphone is a little bit on the hard to drive side, so having the extra power was not so bad. But let me push this stuff to the side briefly, and let's talk about now the next accessory that comes in the box, which is a pair of ear pads. In fact, these are actually the ear pads that come stock on the headphone. And I guess I will flip this guy around to show you that it's got another pair of these are the ones that came in the box that I've swapped out because I personally prefer this set of pads. And what's different between them is you can see that the stock pad, which I have removed, is just kind of like your standard leather. I think it's actually, I can't remember if this one's a real leather or not, but it's, you know, a leather-ish material. And then these ones here are actually like a suede. Like a micro suede texture, and I'm always just kind of a sucker for a micro suede texture ear pad. So if I'm given the option, usually I'm going to go for the micro suede as long as it ends up being the better sounding, or at least as good sounding. And one thing that's really unique about this headphone, this is a thing that they made a point of when they introduced the headphone to me at CanJam, is that it comes with both sets of pads. Swapping them is really easy. Like you just pull it off here. I'm not going to pull it off entirely because I don't want to put it back on. But you just pull it off right here. There's like we'll pull it off because it's pretty easy. You can see it's kind of like a pressure seal, and you push it in. And you just have to kind of like push around the rim of the inside of the ear pad to reseal it. Anyway, swapping it is super easy. But the point I was trying to make is that they're two different materials. And usually when you swap ear pads on a headphone, you are very significantly changing the sound of the headphone. So a lot of people that change pads on their headphones for comfort, for style, for aesthetic, if you don't realize it, all power to you, but probably you are significantly changing the sound, and it might not be for the better. In this case, they actually went out of their way to make sure that both ear pads, sound exactly the same. And I was a little bit skeptical of that fact when I was at CanJam. They told me about it. I didn't do pad swapping at CanJam, but when I got it here in the studio and measured it on my rig, we can look at the measurements in a little bit. Indeed, these things measure just about identical. So it really will come down to your personal preferences. Do you prefer more of a smooth leather pad like this, or do you prefer a softer micro suede like this guy? And I would say that for my mind, the only downside of having a micro suede is that it is maybe more likely to pick up lint. But apart from that, I guess maybe it would soak up face oils and stuff like that. But frankly, it's never really been a problem for me. But there you go. It's a nice little addition. But apart from that, well, you get the headphone itself. So let's talk about the headphone. We'll talk about the build quality and then the comfort. In terms of changes versus the original one that you will see here on the outside, apart from the pads, there's not going to be a whole lot different. There is a little bit of difference here in the headband padding. You can see like this white stitching isn't on the original. In fact, I've got the original here for comparison, but you can see that they're using effectively the same headband design. There's some slight differences here in terms of like the original had a white head logo, whereas the new one has kind of embossed one that just blends in a little bit more, so it looks a little bit sleeker in my opinion. But I don't know, this is a design that calling this one sleek to begin with is a bit of a stretch, because it's a little bit Frankenstein in its design, but it does end up working out fairly well. So there is that. Okay. Anything else to talk about? Even though these things aren't different, I will at least highlight them. You know, the materials in this thing all feel quite nice, right? Like these yokes here are metal. I don't know what these outer panels are made of. I don't know if they're metal or not. They don't feel cold to the touch, but they do certainly feel nice. You've got these outer meshes here, and you know, this unit here is metal. Probably the most standout material here on this headphone is the headband, which is made out of carbon fiber. And I believe a lot of that is because their first headphone they released ended up being really heavy. So they're pretty conscious of minimizing the weight on this one. Now the weight is not super light. It's still 550 grams, which is the same quoted weight that they have for the original, or sorry, the non-audiophile HEDDphone 2. So same weight, but it's still not that lightweight. It's just that the previous one, the original HEDDphone 1, was actually quite heavy. But the other standout thing is just frankly this headband design. So this is a very interesting contraption and series of straps that give you a unique level of adjustment that I don't know if it's a thing I really like, but I certainly don't care too much about it. But here, let me show you. So there's basically, you can see there's this outer strap with the peg, right? And so you release this, and you can imagine that you change the position of this strap to change the size of the headband. But actually this outer strap is actually adjusting the clamp force of the headband. So you can actually make it less clampy or more clampy, which is good because then you can adjust it to the size of your own head, or just whatever your personal comfort level with clamp is. And then underneath that strap is a second strap adjustment with its own set of pegs. That one is the one that actually adjusts basically how large this headband is. And you know, if you've got a larger head, you're going to want to size it up a little bit. Now, I have somewhat of a large head, so I've sized it up a little bit, but here's something you might notice. It's uneven, right? I have it sized up on this side, but not on this side, because if I size it up on both sides evenly, then it's too large for me. And if I don't size it up, then it's too small for me. So for me, to get this to my ideal head size, I needed to have it uneven adjustments, which if you're, you know, a little OCD about this kind of stuff, and I don't know, you wouldn't be an audiophile if you weren't a little OCD, that might bug you a little bit. I've certainly gotten past it, but I don't know, that's something worth considering, and maybe just some feedback in terms of how they might be able to make this better, is find a mechanism that doesn't require such large jumps in order to keep it symmetrical. But I don't know, getting picky about stuff. Okay, anything else to talk about physical form factor before I put this on my head? I mean, I will mention one thing that actually kind of stood out to me as I was looking at the box right before doing this review is they actually offer a 5-year warranty, which is kind of cool. You know, most headphones give you 30, 90 days warranty, maybe a year warranty, 5-year warranty. That's pretty cool. All right, let's talk about fit and comfort. But before I do that, real quick, I'll mention one thing. Well, okay, let's throw this on my head. And I'll mention one thing that was pretty significant about the original HEDDphone 2 that is not the case here with this headphone. All right, this is where there's a couple of big differences. So one, I had issues with the original HEDDphone 2 having pretty significant driver flex, which just means as I fit the headphone, put it on my head, right, and you're generating pressure inside of this little ear cup cavity, that air pressure would cause the AMT driver to flex and crinkle, and it was very, very audible. It wasn't so much an issue when I was just sitting there listening to music, so it wasn't really a distraction from what I was listening to. It's just the sort of thing that kind of makes the headphone feel a little bit more fragile than maybe you want it to feel. Again, I guess it's got a 5-year warranty, so maybe it's not. Maybe I'm not worrying, but I'm worrying about something that doesn't matter. But nonetheless, driver flex just generally, I feel is like an unpleasant thing. This headphone has, as far as I can tell, none of the driver flex. When I was talking with them at CanJam, Freddie was saying that they got rid of most of the driver flex. I cannot generate driver flex out of this thing, even if I squish it against my head and try to generate as much pressure in there as possible, which is probably not a good idea, but I'm testing it for you guys. But yeah, they've solved the driver flex problem, which is frankly fantastic. The other thing, and I think this is related, and is related to the tuning differences and stuff too, is that this headphone is much less open than the original was, okay? So because this is less open, I think that is reducing the amount of air that is flowing through the driver when you do something like that. And that's what's reduced the crinkle. I assume it's something along those lines. But the other side effect is just that this is a less open headphone. It is still an open back headphone. You will still, like, I can still hear my fingers scratching outside my head. But if you're looking for like the most open headphone, this is not it anymore. I would say that the original HEDDphone 2 is quite an open headphone. This one is less so, and that could be a good thing or a bad thing depending on your situation. Like here, as I'm talking to you right now, my voice is a little bit occluded, which might not be the case on a lot of other open back headphones. If I was in an office situation or something like that, this would actually probably be a nice little balance because it's not leaking a lot of sound out of it as well. That's kind of the other benefit, is that the original HEDDphone 2, this one will leak more audio out of the ear cups, whereas this one, because it's a little bit more sealed, will do less. Okay, I haven't really talked about comfort and stuff while I've been yapping about the other stuff. So yeah, let me just say, I think that this headphone is generally pretty comfortable. Yeah, I don't really have any serious complaints with it. You know, it is a little on the clampy side, but again, that's a thing that you can adjust. You can kind of get it to taste. But because it's a little bit on the heavyweight side, again, 550 grams, in my opinion, I want the headphone to be a little bit clampy to stay in place, right? I don't want to feel the weight of the headphone moving itself around. And at the current setting that I've got it, I think it's a nice balance of, you know, being clampy enough to feel secure and fitted on my head. It's not rocking around as I do this, but it's also not overly aggressive in its clamp. So yeah, this is a headphone I've been able to wear for hours and really have no issues with, including even the weight. Again, 550 grams, not super lightweight, but in terms of audiophile headphones, anything under 600 grams, I'm probably not going to have an issue with. Hopefully you have your own experience that you know where your personal limit is. But for me, 550 grams, that's within my limit. Okay, I think that is as much as we can talk about the physical form factor on this headphone. So we're gonna move this headphone to the side and pull up my face. No, we don't need to see my face. We need to see the squig. There we go. We've got the squig. So this is the frequency response that I've measured of the HEDDphone 2 GT. It's up on Squiglink right now. If you want to check it out, I've got it linked in the description down below. But we are going to go over it together to hopefully understand the sound of this thing, at least from the tuning side. And so the tuning of this headphone this is like where a lot of the difference between the GT model and the original comes. And I'll pull up the original in a little bit for a comparison. But just to start with, a couple of things that you can kind of get by comparing this versus this dotted line, which is roughly, just think of that as kind of a neutral sound signature. Versus that dotted line, you can see that there is a hefty bass boost here on the GT model, which was not true of the original HEDDphone 2. Okay, so as they've tuned it for audiophiles, they gave it the bass that the audiophiles asked for. And before, I don't know, some people out there have the impression that audiophiles like neutral, boring headphones. I've spent enough time at audio shows to know that no, audiophiles like bass. So you get the bass here with the GT model. You also get a more filled out lower treble. This is, again, I think you'll see more when I pull up the graph for the original model, but it's filled out the treble region here. It's given us kind of like a more normal mid-range tuning. And that's also, I would say, a little bit on the trebly side. This much, its trebliness, I don't necessarily think is coming across entirely in the graph. When I do a sweep, like a sine sweep of this thing on my head, I hear this peak at around like 12K. I don't necessarily hear this peak, but I basically hear, you know, kind of a peak around 3K. It sounds like it dips and then it comes back up kind of sharply around 12K. But generally I'd say that this is all pretty well balanced, but it does give you just that little bit of extra spice here around there. At least in my ear, that's what I get. And so I think with that little bit of extra spice, a little bit of extra forwardness here in kind of the presence region, plus this bass boost, what we're looking at is kind of just like a warm dense, mild V-shaped sound signature. Yeah, let's call it a V-shaped sound signature. This is a tasteful V-shaped sound signature. It's not going to be overly contrasty or anything like that, but it's got like a bit of warmth to it. Let me pull up for comparison the original model. So that's what we have here in green. And you can see that the original model just had kind of a more funky mid-range tuning. It was overall a much more mid-range forward sound signature, but it was a little bit funky in its mid-range tune, right? It was a little bit boxy here and kind of like the lower mid-range. You can see that it's significantly less bass here on the original, again in the green. And then up here is where we had that kind of pretty precipitous, kind of like treble, I don't know, trough on the original. It's more filled out here on the new GT. And I mean, if I was going for like my ideal sound signature, I'd probably want to have like an adjustment that's somewhere in between, because when I listened to the original two, I had to basically use EQ with this because I didn't really. It sounded a little bit boxy. I didn't really like the way that it sounded out of the box. But with EQ, it was very, very, very satisfying. Whereas with this new model, my EQ is kind of in the middle of the changes that they've made here. So this is a little bit more bass and a little bit more treble than what I'd probably go for. But overall, I would say the big improvement here is that with this new model, I don't feel compelled to use EQ at all. In fact, I think this is a perfectly satisfactory sound out of the box. And I guess that will lead us into talking a little bit more about my subjective listening impressions of this headphone. Okay, so I mentioned this is kind of like a warm, dense, tasteful V-shaped sound signature. Because of that, this is not like an open and airy, kind of bright-tuned headphone, if that's what you're looking for, right? It has just kind of like this hefty, muscular sound to it, right? It's like warm. It's a little bit on the boxed-in side in terms of like stereo width and stuff like that, but it's just got this like nice muscularity to the sound that frankly I like. Like the bass just has a nice tactility to it with this headphone. It's fairly tight, it's punchy, and it is, because of the way it's tuned, a little bit dominant in the mix. Again, a little bit more than I would probably go for my ideal tune if I was going for like my ideal neutral. But if you're looking for a bit of a bass punch in it, I think you're going to be pretty happy with this. It's just deep, dense. The treble does still retain kind of like the snappy transient effect that we got with the original HEDDphone 2, and I guess I'm going to attribute that to the AMT driver. But yeah, you just have like a nice, fast, snappy transient attack on the treble that just adds a nice sense of definition to all the sound. So while you have kind of that thick, meaty low end, right, you're not getting like this muddy, soupy sound. In fact, you still have a nice sense of contrast through there, and it just leaves everything well defined. It doesn't give you a whole lot of, again, that stereo lateral width, but the separation and the definition is on point. It's right there. I would say that, again, as I was kind of talking about with the graph, when I do the sine sweep in my ear, I hear a peak at around 12K. And I think that peak is responsible for what I describe as this being a little bit on the trebly side. It can be a little bit too excited up top, which can sometimes just be on the verge of sibilance with certain tracks that are recorded sibilant, to be fair. But it can be on the verge of that, but also just be a little bit on the zappy side, depending on what you're listening to. So I was listening to Mazzy Star's, oh my gosh, why am I blanking on the name of the song? Fade Into You. There's like this tambourine clash inside of that, in that song, that frankly doesn't sound great on a lot of sets. Like it's a little bit of a harsh recording. And in this set, this is definitely one where I found that the tambourine crash and that just comes across a little bit on the sharp and biting side. So there is a little bit of downside to that. Maybe another way to describe the treble performance is it's a little bit on the grainy side as well. Some of that grainy texture was also true of the original, even though that one didn't have quite the zap and the bite as this one does. So maybe I'm conflating two different sonic effects there, but nonetheless, there's some character to the treble here, and it could be a thing that bothers you, but I don't think it's like it's not like HEDDphone treble or anything like that, if that's what you have in mind. Okay, generally gives you a nice, well-textured sound signature. Mid-range is fairly well-textured. More of that texture comes from, I think, that treble presence, to be honest. And again, like the staging is just kind of so-so. It's not congested, but it's also not a wide-sounding headphone. Okay, so that's how I would describe this, the GT model. But how does it compare to some other headphones? So let's bring in a couple of others. A couple of other best buds for comparison. So of course we got to compare it to the original. And I know it's going to be a little bit hard to tell these apart when I'm pointing to them. Just remember the GT has the suede pads, the original has the non-suede pads. And then all over here, I've got the Audeze MM-500. So price range on this, again, this was $2,200. This one's $2,000. And the MM-500, I believe it is $1,800. This one's a planar magnetic, and then these two are using the AMT drivers. Let's start with the comparison with the original HEDDphone 2. And I kind of already went over this a little bit when I was talking about the frequency response, but overall I would say that the original is just a much more mid-range forward sound signature versus this guy. And now you might think, if you know my listening preferences, I usually like a neutral mid-range forward sound signature, but out of the box, I actually frankly much prefer the new GT model. This one, the mid-range tuning is just a little bit funky. It's got kind of like this low contrast, slightly boxy sound signature to it that, in my opinion, just really begs for EQ. Once you EQ this thing's fantastic. But without EQ, I don't really love listening to it that much. The new GT model, it's got more bass, it's overall better tuning. It's a little bit more trebly here. But the strength here is that I just don't feel the need to EQ this guy at all. Yeah, and in terms of other technical stuff, like maybe this one presents a little bit wider because of it's just less dense in its tonality. But I don't even know if I would really describe it that way because it's a little bit funky in the mid-range tuning. Whereas this guy just sounds kind of natural, you know, it's still a little bit on the warm side. It's a little bit on the bass dominant side, but it sounds natural. This one needs EQ. All right, so that's about as much as you need to know about that comparison. Let me bring this one in because I think this is actually kind of an interesting head-to-head. So this is the Audeze MM-500. This one came out a couple of years ago. And I actually think that this one kind of neatly sits in between the two HEDDphone 2 models, okay? It is still, I would describe, kind of like a mid-range, neutral tuned sound signature, more like the original HEDDphone 2. But without any of like the awkwardness and the boxiness in the vocals. I think this tuning is just fantastic. The tuning on this one is, for me, for my preferences, the better of the bunch. It's mid-range tuned without the boxiness. It doesn't have quite the bass dominance of the GT model, but it's still got a really satisfying punchy bass to it that I would actually describe the bass on this one as being a little bit more articulate, which just means like if you're listening to like a busy track and there's like a bass line underneath of it, right? A lot of the times bass lines are recorded pretty quiet or they're mixed pretty quiet into a song. On this headphone, it can maybe become a little bit more easy to hear the bass tone and maybe it drones a little bit. But here with this headphone, I always found it just easier to follow the bass line and the changes in tone as it goes like that kind of stuff. Just to me, is just a lot more articulate on the MM-500. Other than that, let's see. Hold on, I'm just pulling up my notes on the listening experience. Again, they have like a similar strong sense of physicality, which is what I really like about this headphone, and the GT does some of this. Like again, it's got that muscularness to it. There is a little bit of that here in the MM-500 as well, but because this is tuned a little bit more mid-range forward, I just get like kind of a better sense of spaciousness around vocals, which again, it's the content I like to listen to. Cigarettes After Sex, The Cure. I like to hear the vocals. Men I Trust. I like to hear the vocals and like the music kind of around it. And this to me does that just masterfully. This does an okay job of that. But more, this is, I think, about just the warmer tune and the kind of exciting treble. The treble in this guy is nice and snappy. It's good with, you know, it's got fairly sharp transient attacks, but it doesn't really have any of that grit. It's not as sharp as the GT, which could be a good thing or a bad thing, I guess, depending on your preferences. Personally, I prefer the smoother performance of the treble on the MM-500, but there you go. I don't know. I think that kind of wraps it up for my thoughts here on the GT. I got to give it a score though. So out of 5 stars, the HEDDphone 2 GT. Sorry, the Head Audio HEDDphone 2 GT. I promised not to do that, but I had to do it one more time. I'm going to give this thing 4 stars out of 5. I think this is a significant improvement over the original HEDDphone 2, which the original HEDDphone 2, I had some nice things to say about it. I just needed to use EQ to get myself to a place where I liked using that headphone. This guy, I don't need to use EQ. I'm sure you could still improve it with EQ. So if you're planning to use EQ anyway, maybe it doesn't matter which one you get, although you still get some other benefits like the better ear pads, you get the less driver flex, and then the isolation, which could be a good thing or a bad thing depending on your preferences. But overall, I feel like this is just a better version of the HEDDphone 2. And it's $200 more, but it's like 10% more. It's an expensive headphone from the start. So I feel like if you're considering this headphone, this would be the one that I personally go for. Anything else I wanted to say about it? I don't think so. So with that said, I don't know, if you want to check this headphone out, I've got it linked in the description down below. And while you're down there in the description, please do hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, ding the YouTube bell, and I'll catch you on the next super review. Cheers.
Join with the force of reviews, we now have the tools to brave the misleading world of audio fools. Hey, this review is super, and so are you. Grab your headphones, sniff a graph, and share your thoughts in this pursuit. Let's get with the future.